Initially, this video was going to cover the series of singles matches between Toshiaki Kawada and Stan Hansen between 1990 and 1993. At a certain point, however, I found myself hitting a wall with the material. There was absolutely nothing wrong with the matches on their own. I highly recommend everyone watch all of them. The actual series itself, however, was more good than it was interesting. Again, that's not a comment on the quality of the wrestling. Like I said, all the matches are great. But there's not a lot going on beneath the surface here. Likely because there was probably no real intention to be. Kawada is very much a placeholder opponent for Hansen in between his runs with the Triple Crown title and his attempts at recapturing it. Their feud is never given the kind of specific attention and spotlight that can really elevate it to classic status. And that's fine. This rivalry isn't really positioned to be one of the key focal points of the company. Instead, it's just a series of incredibly well-worked matches that fall into a sequential order. You have the general narrative of a younger native worker rising up through the ranks and getting progressively closer to defeating the big foreigner in the company. It's a story that Hansen famously worked with another young rising Japanese wrestler that year in Kenta Kobashi. Their match from August 29th falls into that same kind of category. It's a great match to watch, to experience, and revisit. But it's just not something that I find there's too much to say about, especially given how it's one of the most beloved and discussed matches of the 90s All Japan canon already. Kobashi has another similarly beloved match later in the year against Dr. Death Steve Williams. It's a match famed not for its intricacies and detail, but because it's just really damn cool. So in lieu of trying to stretch these matches out to have videos of their own, I thought we might as well just go through each of them in a single video. Not every match is meant to be part of a larger, grand plot. Sometimes things are just great on their own, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. Think of them as rest stops during a long road trip. Points of comfort and enjoyment that you find while traveling the King's Road. As I mentioned while covering the series of matches between Stan Hansen and Mitsuharu Misawa, Hansen was a pro wrestler that highly valued the spontaneity of his matches. He had a preference for improvisation and reacting to situations in the moment as a means of preserving the illusion that he was in the middle of an actual fight. I think that's why Hansen operates at his best when his matches have a free-flowing and unstructured feel to them. Given that his style is so heavily based in improvisation, it's not the most consistent and reliable approach to pro wrestling either. But when it works, oh boy does it work to fantastic effect. The match starts hot and frantic with Hansen jumping Kawada at the bell. The hot start allows him to control the action for the most part, but Kawada is nothing but relentless in his own right. Every time Hansen knocks Kawada down, Kawada is quick to get back up and throw a strike of his own. Kawada has never been one for retreat, and it's what keeps him alive in this fight. There's some attempts at leg work in the first act of this match, which is a common theme in a lot of the encounters between these two men and in Kawada's career in general. I love that Kawada responds to the attack on his leg with such great aggression. It belies just how aware he is of that weakness in his game and just how desperately he wants to nip that attack in the bud before it develops any further. Hansen forgoes the legwork in favor of a much more straight-up smackfest. His attack becomes much more straightforward and brutish, as is the strength of Hansen on offense. He even busts out a fantastic tope to Kawada on the outside that looks especially amazing for a man of his size. Kawada just barely escapes further damage on the floor by suplexing Hansen onto the concrete. He further weakens the larger man with an Enzui Lariato that drops Hansen back to the floor. Kawada shows no fear when he takes the fight to Hansen, but the big man just won't be put down easily. He survives the stretch plum and responds to a flurry of slaps with a stiff punch of his own. Kawada remains feisty and aggressive, but Hansen's power keeps him in the driver's seat. By the time he nails Kawada with his jackknife powerbomb, there's little hope left for Kawada in this match. A flurry of desperation strikes offers Kawada his final opening, but Hansen responds with a lariat so powerful that it knocks himself out of the ring. Even then, Kawada still gets one last spin kick in to stun Hansen, but it's not enough. Hansen nails a gruesome lariat to the back of the head to get the decisive win. This is a fantastic match, one of the best of 1993. Scrappy and tightly contested, a real slugfest filled with stiff strikes and brutal action. 4.5 stars for this one. Don't miss out. Much like Kawada, Kobashi had multiple singles matches against Hansen through the early part of the decade. Every encounter led to a Kobashi defeat, however, which isn't all that surprising. From 1990 to 1992, he was firmly third in command as part of Super Generation Army, further back on the hierarchy than Kawada. Part of what makes this match so special is that here in July of 1993, Kobashi finally feels like he's made a concrete step up in the roster. He's now second in command in his stable, behind only Misawa. He's been putting in a series of excellent and fiery performances through the year, especially as part of the hottest feud of 1993. He might not be quite ready for the Triple Crown title, but he's a much bigger deal now than he was just the year before, and he could conceivably topple Hansen on his rise to the top. Hansen starts the match distracted, attacking one of the young boys at ringside. This provides a perfect opening for Kobashi to get the early advantage by going after Hansen. Kobashi spends much of the early half of the match in control, which I think is a bit to the match's detriment. Kobashi just isn't particularly interesting in control. Hansen does great to sell and bump for Kobashi, but Kobashi's offense itself leaves a little to be desired. It's mostly headlocks and chinlocks in between the big kicks and leg drops. Luckily, Hansen hits us with one of the all-time great transitions in wrestling when he gets a boot up from a seated position to knock Kobashi down. I love this moment, probably the best version of a simple wrestling trope that you've seen a million times before. Now firmly in control, Hansen gets to bring all the crazy violence we've come to love from his best stuff, including a powerbomb to the concrete. Kobashi selling for Hansen's big offense here feels like a far more natural fit for him, and it's here that the match really starts to hit its stride. Both performers are able to settle into roles that they're far more suited for. Kobashi even develops a really noticeable shiner over one eye, lending a more visceral dynamic to this match. The bombs become far more high stakes at this point, the strike exchanges much more dramatic. Even Kobashi's attempt to put Hansen out with a sleeper feels credible and tense. Seeing him push past the onslaught that Hansen puts him through is some delightful fighting spirit. It's an excellent display of the kind of determination that's made Kobashi so appealing and enduring as a performer. There's a lot of great stuff in this finishing stretch. Something like Kobashi ducking the Western Lariat and nailing a series of leg drops followed up by a moonsault do a lot to convince you that he has what it takes to get the job done. When his patented moonsault doesn't work, however, Kobashi takes a different tact and grabs every pinning combination he can in an attempt to out-wrestle Hansen, but that's not enough either. With the new strategy failing, he goes back to what he knows best and tries for the moonsault again. But Hansen's recovered and stops him dead in his tracks. There's a final struggle by the turnbuckle, but it doesn't end well for Kobashi. A vicious lariat knocks Kobashi off the top rope, and it's just a matter of Hansen dragging his carcass into a pinfall to get the victory. This match is excellent, but I find that it suffers a bit from the reputation it has. I've seen talk of this being potentially the greatest match of all time, a certified, unassailable classic in the All Japan canon. It is great, and it's much better than a lot of what you'll see these days, but I don't think it quite hits that same elite level of quality. There's a little too much dead air in the opening moments of the match, a problem that just doesn't exist with a similar match like Kawada and Hansen. Still, its qualities aren't hard to quantify. The finishing stretch is tense and spectacular. The final spot is an iconic visual that holds up to this very day. A great match, even if I find it doesn't quite live up to its reputation. 4.25 stars for me. This is a number 1 contenders match for a shot at Misawa's Triple Crown Championship. Although Dr. Death is the odds-on favorite here given that Kobashi is Misawa's tag team partner, a precedent was set in '92 that stablemates still have a chance to potentially go after Misawa for the title. Plus, as I mentioned earlier, Kobashi's gotten much more of a spotlight in '93 as a singles wrestler than he had previously, so there's still a little doubt in the air over who might win. They established pretty early on that this is a real testosterone-fueled battle of pride. That idea is emphasized by the tight lockup to open, the posturing, and all the spots built around being tests of strength. In many ways, it feels like a spiritual predecessor to what the Never Openweight title would become known for decades later. Much like the Hansen match before this, the match suffers from having Kobashi work the early control segments. He just doesn't have an arsenal that lends itself to making extended control segments interesting. The match is at its best when these two get to trade strikes and push each other in that sense. Doc takes control in spectacular fashion, press slamming Kobashi to the outside before following up with a handspring elbow. Doc's much better in control than Kobashi is, mostly focusing on big power moves and strikes. Kobashi having something to overcome also gives him room to tap into what makes his performances work best with his fiery comebacks. The match still does drag at several points, but they throw in all the fun stuff like strikes and suplexes often enough to keep things interesting. In general, though, things are just a little too 50-50 for any narrative momentum to be maintained. For the most part, the two are just taking turns working their spots, which is fine, given that the spots are all pretty damn cool. Besides, this match isn't famous for its layered story or its clever pacing. This match is famous because Doc drops Kobashi on his head, and it's gross, and it's spectacular, and I could watch it all day. Those last few grotesque backdrop suplexes are exactly the kind of violent escalation this match needed to take it to the next level, and Kobashi sells them masterfully. This is the first time the head dropping feels like a real tangible quality of the All Japan style. It will become much more prevalent from here on out, and we'll discuss that further when we get back to it. But here, it's kept to just 3 bumps at the very end of the match. Great stuff. 4 stars for this one. It's a real simple clash of beefy men running into each other until one of them finally stays down. No context needed for this one. Come in and enjoy the carnage. I think what interests me about these 3 matches is how they're still mostly considered key matches in the 90s All Japan canon. And yet, one loses nothing by just skipping them and sticking to the larger narrative surrounding the pillars and their constant fighting. These matches remind me of the fact that the culture that made these matches famous is entirely different from the culture of wrestling today. Most people didn't see these matches in order, seeking out some grand overarching narrative that goes from year to year. In the 90s, these were matches that had to be picked out and found through tape traders. You found the recommended stuff and you worked your way from there. Sure, that's mostly how people discover stuff these days, but the internet has made watching all these matches in chronological order much easier than it's ever been. These aren't really matches that were meant to be pieces of a grander narrative. They're just really good matches that must have been pretty mind-blowing to someone who first saw it on a VHS tape in the 90s. Sometimes, being fresh and exciting for the moment is enough to create a legacy that lasts for decades. Thank you everybody for watching this video and making it all the way to the end. Of course, I want to send a very special shout out to all my supporters on Ko-fi. Thank you to my monthly supporters in Henry, Eddie Roberts, James Draper, Chick Fritz, Matt Brummett, Jacob Dickens, The Smarkdown Podcast, Spiders in My Bed, Tyler Kuhn Williams, Don O'Matic, Joe Humphreys, Arch Stanton, Timothy R. Buchner, Kid Kingpin, Indelaine, Captain Jack Heartless, Christopher Jackson, and Brendan McCarthy. You guys are absolutely amazing. If you guys want to see my videos early, feel free to check out my Ko-fi. That is in the description down below. You are all wonderful. Thank you so much for tuning in, and have a good one.